They called it the Archival Accountability Review. The name was chosen by the tribunal itself, should have told them something about how it would end. I was 47 years old when I walked into that chamber for the first and only time, as a named participant rather than a recorder. I had spent the previous 11 years as an intelligence officer attached to the Joint Treaty Commission's Documentation Wing, a position that most of my colleagues considered a polite exile from the work that mattered. You read, you certified, you maintained the chain of custody on records that no one looked at until someone important wanted to win an argument. It was precise, quiet, unglamorous work, and I was very good at it. My name is Carver Holt. I do not say that to place myself at the center of what happened, because I was not the center of it. The center of it was a room and a procedure and the slow, grinding realization by approximately 230 beings of significant galactic authority that they had designed a machine that would not stop doing what it was designed to do. I am telling this from a distance of 14 years. I tell it plainly because the plain version is the one that holds. The Vyrath Joint Tribunal had existed for something like 3 centuries before it joined the treaty structure. Its original purpose was adjudicating resource and boundary disputes between member states. A slow, formal body that operated by consensus, issued binding rulings, and carried real teeth in the form of economic enforcement mechanisms that the largest commercial blocs in the sector respected and feared in roughly equal measure. Over the 3 centuries before our arrival, it had issued perhaps 800 rulings. 612 had gone in favor of species already seated on the tribunal. When the dispute arose, I had read every one. The tribunal did not consider this a problem. The tribunal considered this the natural consequence of the fact that older members understood the rules better, had participated in writing the procedural codes, and were therefore better positioned to make correct arguments. This explanation was, in its own terms, airtight. It was also, in the context of what followed, the most dangerous thing anyone in that chamber had ever believed. Had been a treaty signatory for 16 years by the time of the Archival Accountability Review. 16 years is not a long time. We had joined the treaty structure because we needed the commercial access, because the alternative was a quiet but effective trade embargo that would have cost us more than joining did, and because the Commission's offer of membership had been framed in language that made refusal look like aggression. We understood what we were agreeing to. We read the procedural codes. We built a documentation wing, to say, we built me and the 11 people I supervised. And we began doing what documentation wings do. Maintaining records with enough precision that when someone eventually tried to use those records against us, challenged the faultful looking at a structure they could not easily dismantle. I am not describing a conspiracy. Describing the normal practice of a species that had been caught unprepared before and decided never to be caught unprepared again, kept records. We kept them meticulously. We kept records of other people's records. And we kept records of what happened when records were altered. And we kept records of the alterations themselves. This is neither heroic nor particularly clever. It is simply what you do when you understand that the institutions you have joined have been used for a long time to produce particular outcomes, and you intend to ensure that those outcomes, going forward, become more expensive. The documentation wing occupied 4 rooms on the Commission's secondary floor. It was not large. We had 1 dedicated archival system with redundant offsite storage, 1 specialist in Sorathi treaty syntax, 1 in Darenian administrative encoding, 2 generalists who covered the remaining member state languages, 7 field-capable officers, myself included, who traveled to treaty proceedings, joint surveys, and administrative reviews to ensure that our presence in any formal process was documented from our own vantage point, in our own records, with our own chain of custody. The other commission offices had documentation wings too. Most of them were smaller than ours, performed their archival function more narrowly. None of them, to my knowledge, maintained the practice of depositing copies of all relevant external communications into the Joint Treaty Archive as a matter of course. We had started doing this in year 4. Director General Senna Marchetti had authorized it. The relevant procedural code permitted it. The Treaty Structures Archive was a shared repository, open to any member state's commission office for deposit and retrieval. We used it. We deposited everything that was ours to deposit, and everything that had been communicated to us in the course of official proceedings. We did this consistently, year after year, for 12 years, before anyone thought to design a procedure that required authentication of all documents in the archive bearing on a specific subject. When they designed such a procedure, they designed it to use against us. The tribunal convened the Archival Accountability Review in response to a complaint filed by 3 member states, the Sarathi Compact, the Direnian Hegemony, and the Kelvari Trade League, alleging that Earth's documentation of certain joint resource surveys had been selectively compiled in ways that distorted the record of prior agreements. The specific complaint was technical, dense, correct in its framing as far as it went. We had compiled the surveys in question. The compilation did reflect particular choices about which data points to foreground. Those choices were permitted under the treaty's procedural codes. The complaint did not dispute this. What it disputed was the spirit. I learned, a Kelvari Commission clerk. I had developed a professional relationship with over 3 years of routine document exchange. The review had been proposed in a closed session 4 months before it was announced. That the motion had passed by margin of 11-3, and that the 3 dissenting votes had been cast by the tribunal's junior members. All species that had joined the treaty structure within the past years, I logged this, I filed it. I said nothing to anyone outside my team. The review procedure had been written by the tribunal's procedural committee over the course of those 4 months. It required the party under review to provide an authorized representative who would appear before the full tribunal, authenticate each record in the tribunal's file as genuine or not genuine, confirm or deny each document's chain of custody, and answer procedural questions put by the tribunal chair. The representative was not permitted to argue the merits of any document. The representative was not permitted to introduce new evidence. The representative was permitted only to authenticate. This procedure, as written, had one purpose: to allow the tribunal to control the pace and direction of the session entirely. The chair would select which records to present. The chair would decide when authentication was complete. The human representative would sit, confirm, project the image of a species explaining itself to a body of its elders. Tribunal sent us the procedural code for the review 22 days before the session. I read it in a single sitting, twice. Then I read it a third time more slowly. Section 14, paragraph 3 was 11 lines long. It had been written, I suspect, by a junior member of the procedural committee who understood the general intent of the section, that the authentication requirement should cover the full administrative record of each surveyed period, but had not been asked to narrow the language because narrowing the language would have required the committee to specify which documents were excluded from the archive's scope, and specifying exclusion would have required the committee to acknowledge that the archive's scope was a question. They had not wanted to acknowledge that the archive's scope was a question. They had wanted a broad mandate that would sweep in whatever they chose to present. They had written one. What they had written, read without charitable interpretation, required authentication of all documents in the Joint Treaty Archive bearing on the administrative record of any survey or agreement relevant to the proceeding. Not all documents in the file the tribunal had compiled. All documents in the archive. When I called Director General Senna Marchetti at midnight on a Thursday and told her what I had found, she did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "You're certain?" I told her I was, she said, and it's in the code they wrote. I told her it was in the code they wrote, in language they had chosen, and that it was structurally impossible to remove without voiding the entire review procedure, because Section 14 was the authentication mandate, and the authentication mandate was the whole mechanism of the session. She was quiet for a long time. Not the quiet of someone calculating. I had worked for Senna Marchetti for 9 years by then, and I knew her various silences, but the quiet of someone setting something down and picking something else up. Then she said, "Are you going to send?" I told her I would go myself. Another long pause. Then she said, "Holt, I need you to understand what you're authorizing yourself to do." I told her I understood exactly what I was authorizing myself to do. I told her I had spent 11 years building that archive, and I was the right person to authenticate it. I told her I would be careful, and I would follow the procedure precisely, and I would not improvise. She said, "That's not what I mean." I told her I knew what she meant. She said, "The committee is going to know the moment the first document comes up." I told her yes. She said, "And then?" I told her the procedure would require them either to continue or to suspend, she said. And if they suspend, I told her the documents would still be in the file, authenticated as to chain of custody, whether the session concluded or not. Still in the record. She was quiet again, longer this time. Then she said very quietly, "Authorized." I spent the next 22 days preparing. I did not prepare arguments. I did not prepare a rebuttal. I prepared an authentication sequence, a specific order in which to confirm records, should the tribunal's chair move through the file in the direction I expected, indexed to the 41 documents the tribunal had included and the 106 Earth had deposited over 16 years. I mapped 11 possible orderings the chair might choose, built a matrix of which documents would surface at which points in each sequence, and identified the 4 documents I wanted confirmed before the chamber understood what was happening, and the 7 I needed confirmed if the chamber understood early and tried to redirect. For each document, I prepared nothing but the confirmation. Genuine, yes, authentic. Confirmed chain of custody, confirmed date of origin, flat answers. The only answers the procedure permitted. My colleague Vesa Oren, who is the sharpest reader I have ever worked alongside, and who had built and maintained the archive with me since year 3 of our membership, asked me on the 16th day of preparation whether I was nervous. I told her no, she said. That's either a lie or something worse. I told her it was something worse. I told her I'd been 11 years to do this particular thing in this particular room, that after 11 years of waiting, there is a quality of readiness that does not feel like nerves anymore. Feels like a door you have been standing in front of and are now finally about to open. She looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded and went back to cross-referencing the secondary sequence, and we did not discuss it again. Transit from Earth's commission station to Vyrath took 14 hours. I spent 11 of them reviewing the matrix. I spent the other 3 sleeping, because Vesa had told me to sleep and she was right that it mattered, and I had learned, in 30 years of field work, to sleep when I needed to rather than when I felt like it. The tribunal chamber on Vyrath Station sits at the intersection of 3 pressurized corridors in what the architectural record describes as a deliberate construction choice. The 3 corridors representing, in the visual vocabulary of Vyrath's founding species, the convergence of past action, present judgment, and future consequence. I am told that the founding species considered this deeply meaningful. What I found, walking down the center corridor toward the chamber doors, was that it was a long walk with no turns to take, and nothing to look at except the doors getting gradually larger as you approach them, and that whoever designed it had understood something about the psychology of arrival that they probably would not have wanted named plainly. The doors were open when I reached them. I walked in. The chamber is a wide, low oval. Tribunal members sit in a tiered arc facing the center floor, the tiers rising gradually so that the full chamber addresses the center from above. The effect is not subtle. You stand at the center of a bowl and 200 pairs of eyes look down at you, and you understand, without being told, this is where the space assigns you. Below, the ceiling is high, the walls pale, the lighting warm but directional. It comes from above, which means that the tiered arc is in relative shadow and the center floor is fully lit. You are on display and they are not. This is intentional. I had read the architectural notes. I walked to the center floor. There was a single chair and a low table with a terminal on it. The terminal was for displaying the documents I would be authenticating. I sat down, placed my case on the table beside the terminal, folded my hands, and waited. The tribunal chair was a Sarathi counselor Vyrath Oren. He had held the chair position for 19 years. He was, by reputation, extremely precise, patient, and skilled at managing the tempo of formal proceedings, qualities that, in a body built on procedure, amount to a very particular kind of power. He had a long, smooth, planed face, a bluish cast to his skin that deepened toward the ridge of his temples, and eyes of a darker blue that were, in person, more watchful than his official portraits showed. He looked at me for a moment before he spoke, looked back. Neither of us said anything, which was appropriate, because the procedure did not call for anything yet. He welcomed me to the proceeding in formal Vyrath treaty language, recited the procedural parameters, confirmed that I understood the scope of my authorized responses, and asked me to confirm my identity and my authorization from Earth's Commission office. I confirmed both, he said. We will begin with the survey compilation files. He selected the first document and projected it on the terminal in front of me. It was a resource survey of the Kelmar Transit Corridor, compiled by Earth's Commission team in the 4th year of our membership. I identified it, confirmed its chain of custody, confirmed the date of compilation, confirmed the authorization signatures. The terminal logged my confirmation. Counselor Oren moved to the second document, a survey of the same corridor, conducted 3 years earlier by a joint Sarathi-Kelvari team. I confirmed it genuine, confirmed its chain of custody, confirmed the authorization signatures. The terminal logged it. He moved to the third document. This was where I understood that he was following the first of my predicted sequences almost exactly. The third document was a routing memo, internal to the Sarathi Compacts Commission Office, that had been included in our archive of the joint survey process because our documentation protocol required us to log all communications touching on the survey's administrative record. The memo had been sent from a Sarathi survey administrator to the Kelvari survey lead 4 months before the joint survey's public release date. Its subject line, in translation, read, "Discrepancy Suppression, Kelmar Final Figures." Counselor Oren displayed it. I looked at it. I confirmed its authenticity, confirmed the chain of custody, confirmed the date, and confirmed that it had been included in Earth's compilation archive in accordance with the procedural code's requirement that all documentation touching the administrative record of a reviewed survey be maintained and available for inspection. There was a pause that lasted approximately 4 seconds. I have replayed those 4 seconds many times. What happened in those 4 seconds was, I believe, the moment that the tribunal's procedural committee realized that their authentication requirement did not distinguish between documents they had included in the file and documents Earth had deposited into the treaty archive, and which were therefore, under the procedural code they had written, part of the record that required authentication. Counselor Oren said, "This document was not filed by the tribunal." I confirmed that it had been filed by Earth's documentation wing, that it resided in the joint treaty archive under the correct indexing codes, that its chain of custody was unbroken, and that under Section 14, Paragraph 3 of the review's procedural code, which required authentication of all documents bearing on the administrative record of any surveyed, period, it was properly before the proceeding. He looked at it for another moment. He moved to the fourth document. The fourth document was a different routing memo. This one was Deherenian, dated 7 years before the joint survey, and it concerned the preparation of a resource inventory for the Pelhari mineral zone. Its subject line, in translation, read, "Filing Adjustment, Pelhari Totals." It was accompanied by 2 versions of the inventory it referenced, one compiled before the adjustment and one after. The figures in the second version were approximately 18% lower. I confirmed it genuine. I confirmed the chain of custody. I confirmed the dates of both attached documents and the routing memo itself. I noted, for the record, that both versions had been archived in Earth's documentation system in accordance with our protocol for maintaining complete administrative histories of all joint survey processes in which Earth had a commercial stake. The chamber was quiet. Counselor Oren moved to the 5th document. It was a Kelvari Trade League internal brief from 9 years prior. It concerned the Sarathi Compacts survey methodology for the upper transit corridors and used language that I will not quote here because the translation is dense, which the terminal's summary field rendered in plain treaty language as Current methodology permits favorable corridor assignments without traceable deviation from formal protocol. I confirmed it. Confirmed the chain of custody. I confirmed the date. There was a longer pause this time. I heard movement in the upper tiers. Kept my eyes on the terminal. Counselor Oren said, with a care that I noticed, "There are documents in this file that the tribunal did not include." This. I confirmed that they had been deposited into the Joint Treaty Archive by Earth's Documentation Wing over the course of our membership in accordance with the treaty's record-keeping requirements, and that the procedural code for the Archival Accountability Review required authentication of all documents bearing on the administrative record of any survey or agreement relevant to the proceeding. I confirmed that I was prepared to continue. He said, "Delegate Holt." I waited. He said, "The intent of this proceeding," I said. "I understand the procedure, Counselor." He stopped. "The thing about a formal proceeding is that it has a procedure. The procedure either controls the proceeding or it does not. It controls the proceeding, then the parties are bound by it. If one party invokes the procedure correctly and the other asks that party to apply, it selectively, the other party, is asking the first to violate the procedure the tribunal itself wrote. This is not a position that a body of Counselor Oren's stature could hold openly. In session, on the record, he knew this. I could see it in the way he had said my name, and in the way he had not finished the sentence. He moved to the 6th document. I will not detail every document in the sequence. There were, in the file as properly constituted under the procedure, 147 documents. 41 of them had been included by the tribunal. 106 had been deposited by Earth's Documentation Wing into the Joint Treaty Archive over 16 years, and had become part of the proceedings record the moment that procedural committee wrote, Section 14, Paragraph 3. Of the 106 documents Earth had contributed, 92 were administrative records of the ordinary kind. Survey filings, confirmations, chain of custody logs, communication threads of no particular significance. 14 were not. The 14 included 4 internal communications from member states' survey teams, discussing adjustments to filed figures before public release. 3 routing memos referencing coordination between member states' commission offices on survey results before those results were presented to the treaty body. 2 sets of paired documents, a pre-adjustment and a post-adjustment version of a filed inventory, in which the adjustments favored one party in a subsequent boundary dispute. 2 after-action reviews from tribunal staff noting procedural irregularities in prior sessions that had been marked as resolved without public record of the resolution. And 3 communications in the files of separate member states' offices that referenced the same consultation with the same senior tribunal administrator on 3 separate occasions when disputes had been pending before. The body I authenticated each one as it appeared. Chain of custody confirmed, date confirmed, authenticity confirmed, inclusion in the archive confirmed, each one logged. By the 47th document, chamber had the quality of a room that has been holding its breath and is beginning to understand that it cannot hold it much longer. Did not look up. I kept my eyes on the terminal. I confirmed what was in front of me. I moved to the next. There was a particular quality to the silence in the upper tiers that I noticed around the 35th document. It was not the silence of attention. The silence of 200 beings listening carefully to a formal proceeding. It was something quieter and heavier than that. It was the silence that comes when a large body of people have all reached the same understanding at roughly the same moment and are each waiting privately for someone else to see it first. I had been in rooms with that silence before. I knew what it meant. I kept my eyes on the terminal. At the 43rd document, a Dorenian senior delegate seated in the 3rd tier made a brief procedural motion to pause the session for a formal consultation among tribunal members. The chair acknowledged it, noted that such a motion required a majority vote to carry, called for the vote, and reported the outcome. The motion failed. The majority voted to continue. I noted this carefully because the outcome told me something important. The body that had designed the procedure contained a majority who believed, even at that point, that continuing was preferable to the alternative. What they believed the alternative to be, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that continuing the session meant continuing to authenticate, and that they voted for it. At the 63rd document, Counselor Oren called a recess. The recess lasted 40 minutes. I stayed in my chair. Tribunal aide came to offer me refreshment, which I accepted. Vesa Oren had told me before I left that whatever I did in the chamber, I should eat and drink normally because it projects a quality that cannot be performed. She was right. I drank the water, ate the small plate of grain and seed compound that is apparently the standard refreshment for formal guests on Vyrath Station, and reviewed the authentication index in my case to confirm which documents remained. 84. I closed the case, folded my hands, and waited. The chamber behind me was not empty during the recess. I could hear movement, low conversation, particular resonance of a large enclosed space, occupied by beings who are trying to talk quietly and not entirely succeeding. Did not turn around. There was no purpose buffed by turning around. When the session resumed, Counselor Oren was accompanied at the chair's table by two other tribunal members I recognized. Counselor Deheranian First Seat Meret Olvain, and a Kelvari senior member whose name I had in my records, but had not spoken to directly. They sat behind the chair's table with Oren and looked at me with an expression that I would describe, after careful thought, as the expression of beings who have walked into a room and found the furniture arranged differently than they had arranged it. Not hostile, not angry. Something closer to a controlled, effortful steadiness. The expression of people who are maintaining composure, because composure is what the situation requires, and they are disciplined enough to provide it. Counselor Oren said, "Delegate Holt, Tribunal would like to discuss the scope of the authentication process." I said, "I'm prepared to continue," he said. "There may be documents in the file that fall outside the intended scope of this proceeding." I said, "I understand the procedure as written, Counselor. If the tribunal would like to revise the procedural code, I can await the completion of that process. Under the current code, prepared to continue." Counselor Olvain leaned forward. Her voice was lower than Oren's and more controlled. She said, "Delegate, you understand that this proceeding was convened to address specific concerns about Earth's documentation practices." I said, "I understand the proceeding was convened under the Archival Accountability Review procedure, and I'm prepared to fulfill the requirements of that procedure." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "The documents you have been authenticating are not the documents the tribunal intended to review." I said, "They are the documents the procedure requires me to authenticate." There was a silence. Counselor Oren said very quietly, "Delegate Holt, we are asking you to stop." I looked at him. I said, "I know." I reached into my case, placed the full authentication index on the table beside the terminal, and pushed it slightly toward the chair's position. It contained the full list of all 147 documents, with authentication status marked for each. 63 confirmed. 84 awaiting, I said. "We have 84 documents remaining." I waited. He looked at the index. He looked at it for a long time. The two members beside him did not speak. The chamber behind me was completely still. I had been in quiet rooms before, debriefs, closed sessions, the hour after a negotiation breaks down, and I knew the different registers of silence. The silence that is waiting, the silence that is calculating, the silence that is grieving. This one was the last kind. It was the silence of a body understanding that the procedure it had written, for the purpose it had intended, had been used to do something it had not intended, and could not now undo, because every document I had confirmed was in the treaty record and would remain there. He did not reach for the index. He said, "The session is recessed pending procedural review," I said. "Noted." I picked up the authentication index, returned it to my case, and stood. I walked back out through the center corridor. The doors were still open. The long walk that had looked like a corridor, designed to make arrivals feel small, looked, going the other direction, exactly like what it had always also been. A way out. I was on the transit platform when Vesa Oren reached me on the secure channel. She asked how it had gone. I told her we had authenticated 63 of 147 documents before the session was recessed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did they ask you to stop?" I told her they did. She said, "And?" Told her I kept going until they recessed the session. Another pause then. "How many of the 14?" I told her 11. 3 remained in the pending file. She said, "Holt." I waited. She said, "The remaining 3?" I told her yes. She said, "Both sets of paired documents?" I told her, "Both." She said, "In the administrator communications?" "All 3, I told her. She did not say anything after that for long enough that I checked the connection to confirm it was still open. Then she said, very quietly, "Okay." I boarded the transit. The tribunal's procedural review lasted 11 weeks. I was not invited back. Neither, it should be noted, was anyone else. The review was formally suspended. Not withdrawn. Not concluded. But suspended pending the completion of a comprehensive review of the review's procedural code. The comprehensive review of the procedural code was assigned to a working committee. The working committee has been, to my knowledge, meeting regularly for 14 years. Its conclusions, if any have been reached, have not been made public. Earth received no ruling. No sanction was imposed. The complaint filed by the Vyrath Compact, the Duranian Hegemony, and the Kelvari Trade League was not formally withdrawn, because withdrawing it would have required acknowledging the grounds for withdrawal. It was, instead, categorized as pending the completion of the procedural committee's work. It has remained in that category for 14 years. There were consequences, of course, of a kind that do not appear in official records. The 3 junior member states whose dissenting votes I mentioned at the outset, the ones who had voted against the review in closed session, found, in the years that followed, that certain resource negotiations moved somewhat more efficiently than they had before. I do not attribute this to cause and effect with any certainty. I note it as a data point, which is what it is. The tribunal continued to function, issued rulings. The ratio of outcomes shifted measurably over the subsequent decade. Not dramatically, these things rarely move dramatically, but measurably. Vesa Oren tracks it. She sends me an updated summary on the anniversary of the session every year. The last one showed a ratio of roughly 53 to 47 over the most recent 5-year window, compared to the 76 to 24 that it held for the previous century. She adds no commentary to the summary. She does not need to. I spent 3 more years in the documentation wing after the session, then moved into a senior advisory role at the commission before retiring 6 years ago. The wing itself has expanded since my time. 17 people now, 2 dedicated legal analysts, a specialist in treaty archive indexing who is, I am told, better at the work than I ever was. I do not doubt it. The work compounds. The longer you do it, the more you know what to look for, and the more of what you find is worth keeping. I do not speak at conferences. I have been asked, several times, to write a formal account of the session for treaty structure historians. I have declined each time, because a formal account would require me to characterize what I did in terms that would make it more dramatic than it was, and what I did was not dramatic. I read a procedure. I followed it. I answered the questions the procedure permitted me to answer. Counselor Oren said, "Stop." I said I knew, and I did know. I knew exactly what he was asking and exactly why he was asking it and exactly what it would mean if I stopped. I knew it the way you know any fact that you have known for long enough that it no longer requires examination. It is simply present, occupying its place, waiting to be used. The Archival Accountability Review was designed to produce a specific image, human representative, seated below the full weight of galactic institutional authority, affirming a record the tribunal had already shaped to its purposes, projecting to all observers that Earth was accountable to a structure it had not built and did not control. The image was meant to be instructive. It was meant to teach us something about our position. I authenticated 63 documents instead. 3 of them were ones I had been waiting 11 years to put in front of a body that was required, by its own procedure, to receive them. When Counselor Oren looked at that index and understood what was left in it, he looked at the architecture of the next few hours. He looked at what the treaty record would contain when the session ended. He looked at a procedure that had no stopping mechanisms, except the one he had just invoked. and at the fact that invoking it would leave the 3 remaining documents unconfirmed in the pending file of a suspended proceeding. Present, authenticated as to chain of custody, awaiting only the session that never came. He recessed the session. The 3 documents are still in the pending file. I do not know if they will ever be authenticated. That is not the point of them. Point of them is the file. The point of them is that they are there. Point of them is that every member of the tribunal's procedural committee knows what is in that file and knows that it was placed there by a documentation wing that has been reading, certifying, and maintaining records for 16 years, and that has more records and knows exactly where they go. The tribunal wrote a procedure. The procedure required authentication. We authenticated. The rest is the treaty record. I keep a copy of the authentication index in my office, not for any practical purpose. The treaty archive has it, properly indexed, accessible to any party with the right credentials. I keep it because Vesa Oren framed it and sent it to me on the day I retired. In the upper right corner in her handwriting she wrote the final figure, 63,147. She meant it as something between a joke and a monument. But there are mornings when I look at it and think about the 84 documents still pending in that file, sitting in a suspended proceeding with no scheduled resumption date, and I think that 63 was exactly the right number. Not enough to empty the file. Enough to teach them what the file contains. There is one more thing I have not said, because it belongs at the end rather than the beginning, though it concerns the beginning. In the second year of my work in the documentation wing, before the treaty archive practice was established, before Vesa Oren joined the team, before I had any sense of what the archive might eventually become, I attended a boundary dispute proceeding between the Sarathi Compact and a smaller species, the Yanari Collective, over mineral rights in the Outer Kelmar Corridor. I was there as a documentation observer, a participant. My job was to watch, log, and file. I did all 3. The Yanari Collective's representative was a slight elderly being named, in translation, something like Senior Ledger Keeper Vor. She had brought with her a case of documents, physical documents, in a format so old that the tribunal's processing equipment initially could not read them. She had also brought, inside the same case, a manually operated reader for the format which she had sourced apparently from an archive museum on her homeworld. The tribunal chair at the time, not Oren, his predecessor, had allowed this with visible impatience. Senior Ledger Keeper Vor had opened her documents and read from them for approximately 4 hours. The Sarathi team had argued correctly that none of the documents Vor cited had been deposited into the Joint Treaty Archive and therefore could not be admitted as formal record. Chair had agreed Vor's documents were excluded. The tribunal ruled in favor of the Sarathi Compact. I had watched all of this from the recorder's tier. After the ruling, as the chamber was clearing, Vor had remained at the center table for a long time, not protesting, not speaking, simply sitting with her case of documents open in front of her and her hands flat on the table. She had not wept, had not remonstrated, had not addressed the chamber. She had eventually closed the case, stood, and walked out through the same corridor I would walk out through 12 years later. I filed my observation log. I filed the procedural record. And then I went back to my office and I wrote, in a document I kept on the local system rather than in the shared archive, a single question. What would happen if those documents were already in the archive before the proceeding began? I kept that document for 12 years. I never showed it to anyone. I never needed to. The Yanari Collective, I should note, eventually resolved their boundary dispute through a bilateral negotiation with the Sarathi Compact that took 9 years and resulted in a settlement that gave them approximately 60% of what Vor's documents had claimed. I do not know if Vor lived to see it. I did not look slowly enough to know. What I know is that the case stayed in my mind, the way certain cases do. Not because of what happened in the chamber, but because of Vor sitting with her hands flat on the table afterward, and the way she had looked at the closed case before she stood up. When I built the archive, I built it for the next proceeding that someone tried to run against us. I built it against the version of that room where we would be in Vor's position, with documents the chamber would not receive. I built it so that, when someone designed a procedure intended to use a record against us, the record they had chosen would already contain what we had placed inside it, legally, procedurally, without exception or ambiguity, waiting quietly in a shared repository that their own rules required them to consult. Vesa Oren once asked me whether I thought about the Yanari collective case when I was preparing for the review session. I told her I thought about it every day I worked in that office. Not specifically and not dramatically, but the way you think about the thing that told you why the work mattered. It is not in the background. It is in the foundation, she said. Do you think Vor would have found it satisfying? I thought about that for a while. Vor had not been trying to bring a proceeding to a halt. She had been trying to win one. What I had done was different. I had not tried to win. I had tried to ensure that the record existed and was visible and could not be unmade. Those are not the same thing, I told Vesa. Probably not. Probably Vor would have found it unsatisfying in the way that all institutional remedies are unsatisfying. Oblique, slow, and never quite proportionate to what was done. The Yanari collective lost their case. The boundary ruling stood. Vor's documents were excluded. No index, no archive practice, no procedural maneuver 14 years later undoes any of that. Vesa said, but the ratio moved. I told her yes. The ratio moved, she said. Then it's something. I told her it was something. It is the kind of something that takes a long time to become visible, and that will never be pointed at and named. And that matters anyway. Not because it corrects what was done, because it changes what can be done next. That is not justice. I want to be honest about that. The documentation wing does not deliver justice. It delivers record. The record is imperfect, incomplete, and subject to interpretation. What it is not subject is erasure, because every entry in that archive is triple indexed, off-site backed, and logged in the custody chain of a documentation system that has been running without interruption for 16 years, and will, as far as I can determine, continue running indefinitely. Vor's case is not in that system. It predated our membership. But when I imagine what she would have said, sitting at that table, in Vyrath Station Center Hall, with her hands flat on her closed case, if someone had told her that 12 years later, a documentation officer from a newly joined species would sit in the same chair she had sat in, with a procedure designed to work against that species and would authenticate 63 documents before the tribunal's chair asked him to stop, think she would have nodded just once, slowly, not satisfied, not vindicated, just noted. That is, I think, the correct response. It is the one I carry.